let's look at the first part of the title, Living U.S.-China Relations. And I can think of a couple ways to read that. Having read the book, I have some sense of how you read it, but maybe you can just tell us what that means, living U.S.-China relations.
Well, I think there are a number of possibilities, and that one thing that appealed to me about the title is there are a number of possibilities. One is that, and it's kind of tough to write an objective history on the one hand and a memoir kind of thing on the other. So living U.S.-China relations refers to my 60 years of interaction at various levels over time and so forth. So it's in that sense, my living, my experience of the relationship. But it's also, I think, meant to convey a deeper idea, and that is the U.S.-China relationship is a living, evolving phenomenon. And if there's, I hope, more than one takeaway, but one takeaway is that the way to think, in my view, about U.S.-China relations is that it's a society-to-society relationship. And that means that we interact at many levels, the global level, national level, province, state level, municipal level, individual level, and then multilateral organizations, and so forth. And to properly, that calls for a lot of explanation, but I mean productively manage U.S.-China relations, we have to pay attention to and nurture the healthy interaction at all of these different levels. Well, the odds of managing the relationship between the United States and China with its 20% of world people at all five levels simultaneously suggests to me it's not possible. So it's a kind of objective for management to keep all these. But we're always going to have problems and frictions at one or more of these levels all the time. So what I mean is it's more like gardening. You don't finish the task. You don't manage U.S.-China relations for eternity. It's like weeding your garden. So it's that kind of sense that I wanted to convey.
The job is never done.
Right.
Yeah, and that definitely comes through, and the complexity of it comes through. Well, one of the things that is highlighted in the book was the absence of data on how many students from China were in the United States.
Right.
And so maybe we'll get into how you stepped in, your organization stepped in to address that. But let's
just spit in a point right there, and that is to say, I think one of the points I try to make is if you don't understand your own country and the problems we have, whether it's building the big dig under Boston, a tunnel that had a saga that would put to shame some of the stories about infrastructure in China. If you don't know about your own society, you're really not in a position to assess where China's similar and different. And I think a major theme of my book is, in many respects, we have the same problems, or arguably the same, or near enough that we can learn from each other in that. And that's one reason I paid attention to infrastructure, because it crosses boundaries, it forces units to deal with each other, and you find out what the different array of interests is.
Yeah, and that comes through. We'll go deeper into that question. And infrastructure is such a great example because it cross-cuts geography, various jurisdictions, different interests that you highlight. But here in California, we're still waiting for that high-speed rail.
Well, bless Jerry Brown.
Yeah, well, bless Jerry Brown that he could be governor for 8 years in two blocks and still not get to see it, delivered. Let me take you, though, to the second part of your title, From Cold War to Cold War. Now, the first Cold War, no trouble there. You come of age in California, you join the Army Reserve and serve as a medic as a medic for a specific time, and then in some other roles later on. So that part of the Cold War we get, right? This is the hot war of Vietnam. Yeah.
Duck and cover, get under the desk, put your hands behind your neck and hope for the best.
Yeah, and so, that's what gets broken finally with Richard Nixon's so-called opening, and from a Chinese perspective, Mao's opening to the United States. So we get that part of the Cold War, but you've concluded that's where we're at again?
Well, I don't quite conclude we're exactly where we were before. So, but I think the similarities are rapidly overshadowing the differences. And I should say that you've put your finger on what people, if there's critique to be had, and there are plenty to critique, is that this is, we are not quite at what would fairly be called a Cold War. Now remember, I named this, the title was probably a year and a half, two ago when I fixed on it. I'm much more of the belief it's accurate now than whatever degree I believed before. So I've been going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, that the relationship has deteriorated.
Substantially. And we all had good hopes for the San Francisco meeting and the Bali meeting prior to that between our two presidents. I don't mean it didn't accomplish anything, but it didn't fundamentally, in my view, change the trajectory. Now, the reason I say it's not exactly the same is we had, I would say, zero economic interdependence with the Soviet Union. If you look at all the years that the Soviet Union sent students to the United States, we traded them one for one, and it was a handful over the 70 years of the Soviet Union. China in the last year, Stan's the big expert here, but I use about 370,000 by 2019. So the degree of intellectual interdependence, the degree to which investment was going across borders, granted, though that was not a phenomenon in the first Cold War and so forth. On the other hand, there are areas that actually make it more dangerous than our first Cold War. I would just put cyber interdependence, the capacity to disrupt fundamental social processes, power grids, bank records, social security numbers. The opportunities, we're seeing it now with respect to disinformation and elections and so forth. So in some ways, it's actually more worrisome. Also, the degree to which we've militarized space and information. So in some ways, I could argue, yes, it's not like the first Cold War, it's worse. But I don't think that's quite a balanced assessment either. But what leads me to say that I think it's at least comparable to the First World War or First Cold War is arms race. That we are in an arms race. I just invite you to look at any series on weapons development, military spending, and so on. We're each going up just in publicly available numbers at 7 or 8%. Any number compounded by 7 or 8% becomes a big number real fast. So there's that whole dimension. Ideological. We've defined the problem, or at least I will say the waning current administration has the problem between democracy and autocracy. I'm not saying that's a wrong definition, but it's certainly ideological in character. What was another feature of the Cold War was alliance building, and we're creating alphabet organizations for security like crazy, and the Chinese are trying to create regional and other organizations to serve their interests, like BRICS and the RCEP and all of this acronyms. So alliance building, ideology, arms race, plus all these new possibilities, I think it's at least an arguably fair characterization. And the reason I didn't shy away from that is I want to get people's attention. We're sleepwalking into a very dangerous circumstance. That's my view.
And it's a dramatic one. And you highlight in the book how being a firefighter at Stanford, being a medic, awareness of the costs and risks that comes through. One of the things that also comes through is that, yes, it's not Cold War in the sense that we don't have constant contact. We're not constantly buying things and selling things and trading and otherwise engaging. But the zones of friction zones of potential military conflict are greater than they were actually during the Soviet period.
Right. Oh, I mean, just for instance, we're all moving towards the alternative energy sources and dependent on what are called rare earths. Not actually all that rare, but it's a long story. And China has decided it is going to constrain the export of those, which drives a whole series of our reactions: domestic exploitation, find third countries, ecological damage associated with the extraction of these minerals and so forth. And that's just one area. Precisely the fact that we had so much interdependence means we have our hands around each other's throat in more areas than we ever did with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, there are more push button things, more places where you can do something that will cause trouble.
Exactly. And, you know, the Chinese will retaliate. And the point I continually make is there's not a search for blame here. You don't, maybe I should have, but I don't have a search for who's at fault, because it's a process in which we're each reacting to the other. It might have been an interesting question on day one, who started it, but very rapidly that becomes totally irrelevant.
Yeah, that definitely comes through, that, you know, everybody has a hand in this.
Yeah.
That's definitely there. In 2024, when you write this book, you actually write, though, an enemy in fact, if not words.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we have the words? And what does it mean to be an enemy in fact?
Okay, well, first of all, the reason what I had in mind when I wrote that, and not every formulation turns out to have been the best, but the logic behind it is the way we are describing. I was just in China, and I can't tell you how many times both, but particularly the Americans, define this as a competitive relationship. And people in Washington have told me, we use competition because that seems to be a little less severe. No one actually wants to be responsible for a highly antagonistic, because then will they be able to control it? So competition is what we've agreed on as the description of the relationship.
The American side has agreed on that.
Yeah, yes.
The Chinese side is not happy with
the Chinese have agreed we've done that. But the point is that the reigning the word here is competition. And that's toward, on a spectrum of words, that's not the most hostile. So they see that as a sign of moderation. But I point out, I think both in the book, and I did when I was speaking at various places in China, competition itself is not a uniformity. Competition can be, you know, track stars, USC track stars, at the starting block, gun goes off, stay in your lane, and whoever gets to the other end wins. That's benign, indeed productive competition. But there's another kind of competition, and that's track stars get a starting block, gun goes off, and I trip the guy in the lane next to me. That is an entirely different type of competition, and we're going in that direction. Both, when I say we, I don't mean we just the US, I mean we, China and the United States. And the Chinese are convinced that we're involved in trying to slow them down to maintain economic dominance and security dominance. And we're pretty much convinced that's what they're trying to do.
To attain those things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is really well developed in both the beginning of the book and at the end of the book, and anecdotes to it come through the middle of the book. But the bulk of the book deals with this period that we'll call engagement. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, that's
and you use
chunk.
that. Yeah. And one of the really powerful points that you make is that if we're now in a time of competition or contention, and if that was the case when we were fighting each other in Korea and during the 1960s, up to the Nixon Mao meetings, that the period in between is much longer, and that you argue that engagement wasn't really a plan. It's something that happened.
Right.
Can you tell us what engagement means, and then characterize it and how it morphed through these periods. And then the follow-up question to that is, why did that come to an end?
Well, you'll steer me towards
Okay.
those. There were multiple commas
Multiple
and
points in
clauses
there, yeah.
there. So let me try to.
Sure.
First of all, I think buried in not very far deeply, but uniformly throughout is the sort of notion that our relationship moves in cycles. And so it notes all the years since 1949. A lot of it was conflict. I think I said 30 some years, and about 40 some years not, something on that magnitude. And so we've had our ups and downs, and a realistic interpretation, I believe, of our relationship is we'll always have ups and downs. And I try to say, particularly to younger students, they're wondering if they ought to go into this field and so on. There is always a positive role to be played. If we're on an upswing, how do we keep the momentum in a positive direction going? And when there's a downswing, how do we stop and shorten the slide? So there's this kind of, and I try to explain why there are these cycles. It may or may not be compelling to some, but that is the sort of framework that it creates a sense of there are differences, and your job may change over the changing relationship. So that's sort of first one. Secondly, there's a kind of cliche that's taken hold, maybe from about 2017, a Foreign Affairs 2017 by Kurt Campbell and Eli Ratner in Foreign Affairs.
Both important officials in the current administration.
Right.
Today.
And one's the Assistant Secretary of Defense, the other is Deputy Secretary of State. And so I would say their analysis counts for a hell of a lot more than mine if you're just looking at pure power. But in any case, their point was that misguided people, not evil, when they didn't put it in that context, but misguided people thought the mere act of intellectual and economic interaction would unleash pluralism in China and lead to a more cooperative relationship. And their basic point is you were sold a bill of goods. And I think that's, well, I think it's an incorrect analysis, but it's certainly an incomplete analysis. And so I spent considerable time trying to talk about what I think the pluses of that approximately, depending on when you think engagement started and ended, that approximately 40 years produced tremendous gains. And I try to identify what they are, and I talk about, for instance, we cooperated on reducing food loss in China. You know, China, when I first went there, had a food insufficiency problem, and now obesity is a major problem in China. Now, I call that progress, although, you know, well, it is progress, actually. Life expectancy and everything else. I point to cancer research. And the reason I spent so much time on the gains is if you don't think engagement produced any gains, then you don't argue about how to preserve it or retrieve it or salvage it or whatever vocabulary you want to use. So I think it's very dangerous to not give a balanced analysis. Here were the gains, here were the losses. How do we maximize the gains, minimize the losses, rather than this dichotomous sort of, this was an illusion. Also, I say it wasn't a strategy, because I think engagement unfolded as a very natural bi-societal process. In each of our societies, we have lots of interest groups. And you can look at Mao and Nixon and Deng and Brzezinski and Carter as having been on a mountaintop, and they pushed a snowball down the mountain. And as it went down the mountain, it accumulated constituencies. I talk about Father Hesburgh, who was on the board of the National Committee, president of Notre Dame. And he says it's a Christian duty to reconcile with 25% of the world's people. Business firms, you know, our economy, you can only consume so many washing machines and refrigerators, and then you got to start selling them to somebody else. At the beginning of engagement, American multinationals all saw, not all, but many of them saw enormous markets. And we were talking at lunch about the advertising industry and all of that. So there were enormous economic gains. So there were strategic gains. We had no war with China. We had the Vietnam War and the Korean War that had a lot to do with China, but afterwards we didn't. And those were enormously costly to not only us, but to people in the region, China, and so forth. So I think the reading that this was a plan and that it went awry is incorrect on both of those. It wasn't a plan, and it didn't entirely go awry. Now, as that snowball was going down the hill, a lot of people in the end got crushed, and they might have been manufacturers in the Midwest. In China, people got crushed by globalization. Northeast didn't do so greatly, certainly not like Guangzhou and southern China. The party lost, because once the market took over, there was less need for party regulation. So there were losers on both sides, and finally, in our respective polities, they've gained enough influence to change the character of relations. And anyway, that's the kind of explanation I had in mind.
Yeah, and you highlight that once barriers came down, you know, people from the United States and also in China wanted this contact for their own interests. They had no grand strategy either. They saw opportunity.
Oh, look I'm a professor out at Ohio State, and our governor sets up a relationship, and I happen to be one of the few people in the state studying contemporary China, so he has to call me to say, would Ohio State like to have a relationship with the province of Hubei? Well, this audience, everybody will probably know where Hubei is, but I'll guarantee you 99% of most Americans have no idea where Hubei is. But they were desperate for contact with the world. They opened up to Ohio State, and to make things worse, I did field research in China, and it launched my career, and I felt like I learned a lot in China by talking to people. And in fact, that sort of became my modus operandi for my career, was trying to understand how China works from talking to Chinese people. Really. So, I mean, that's just one person, but this is multiplied across all the human endeavors.
Yeah, and you highlight, you mentioned benefits, certainly benefits within China, but you also highlight, and this actually may be from the 2019 article on the subject, where the FAA works with Chinese and the U.S. aerospace industry works with Chinese partners, and as a consequence, China goes from one of the least safe places to fly to one of the more safe places. Right. And so that's a consequence for anybody flying in a Chinese aircraft. Exactly. Or a
Russian
Chinese
aircraft
carrier in China, all of that. But also one of the things you highlight is, of course, China becomes the largest market for one of our most important companies, Boeing.
Just a codicil to that, because basically everyone who has been to China since about 1985 has had a longer life expectancy than they would have had this development of air traffic control and air management. I got on a plane just, with Chengdu and coming to Shanghai. And we went over the foothills, separate Chengdu from Shanghai. And I happened to be in the back of the plane, and so the tossing was considerable. And I said to myself, well, I'm sure glad I'm not on a Russian airplane here. And what it turned out is when I got back to my seat, I noted they had signs on the back of the seat and the safety card. This was China's new CR919, I think. It was on the first run. I don't mean the very first, but the first regular service route. It was a Chinese-made aircraft. And I couldn't believe it. It looked, if they hadn't told me what airplane I was on, I would have thought it. And all I can report is I made it from Chengdu to Shanghai, a perfectly normal flight. China has done, and the same story about progress, the high-speed rail development and so on. So I think And we ought to, when China has great success, we ought to celebrate it. You know, I know that's about as far away from realism and internet relations as you can get, but it's quite impressive in many domains what China's accomplished.
I've got a bunch more questions, but I'm only going to be selfish here for a couple more minutes and ask a couple of them. And then we'll go to the audience, and of course, we'll want to know where we go from here in terms of the U.S.-China relationship. But one of the things that comes through in your book are two big points about the role of individuals, both individuals that most people know and individuals that people have never met, never heard, that sort of thing. So that's one point about the role of individuals. And the other is this point you make about systems. And so this comes out of your work on healthcare, it comes out of your work on water control, water management, all of those things, that systems matter, that bureaucracies matter, and that's where we start to see far more similarities than differences. Let me ask you to start with individuals that matter. And so the first two that you highlight in the book, one doesn't have a name. He's a guy standing on a road with piles of dirt. And you ask him something and learn something, not what you asked, but you learn a bigger lesson from that. And the second person is actually somebody you meet first, and that's Miss Turner. Miss Florence Turner at Powell High School. And I bring this up to honor educators in the audience, but also to remember students in the audience about the role of education, the role of educators. Can you tell us why those two matter? Then I'll ask about a couple famous people.
Well, I'll start with the old man and the dirt. I was on a group that went, I won't go into the detail, it went right after Mao died. They closed China to foreign entry for about 30 days. Well, exactly 30 days. And then our group, which was concerned with steroid chemistry, meaning birth control related chemistry, came in, and that tells you something. China was, the minute Mao died, Deng was committed to getting population under control. We can argue about all the subsequent dislocations, but I won't go into that. So anyway, after Mao had died, it was sort of like, for me at least, going to the far side of the moon.
This is before diplomatic relations, formal diplomatic relations.
In 1976 in October. And Mao died September 9th of 1976. So anyway, I was determined to learn all I could about China in the shortest possible time. And so each morning I'd get up at 5 o'clock and I wanted to see the city wake up. And, you know, when it's unguarded, fresh, every day is new. But Beijing was a series of hutung, alleyways. And anyway, so I'd go in a different direction for an hour, and then to 4 days, 4 directions, so on. So I mean, I needed to get back by 8 o'clock to eat breakfast. So we'd go on our forced drive of political tourism. Anyway, the first couple of days, people would see me coming, and Caucasian or West, and they would head to the other side of the street. They clearly didn't want to be in the position of having to talk to me. At that point, China didn't know its leaders. The whole situation was unclear, but foreigners clearly were a risk factor, of which I was one. So anyway, I finally bought at the Friendship store a PLA coat and jacket, red star on the hat, and got up early in the morning where it was kind of obscure, and was walking through the hutung, and I turned the corner, and this old man was by the water spigot, brushing his teeth with his enamel bowl. And this wave of fear washed across his face. And I said, Ni hao, wo shi Meiguoren. I'm an American, which was like the worst combination of things I could have told him if I was trying to reassure him. Anyway, so I was looking around, what can I talk about that's not a big problem? And I saw the dirt. And I said to the man, what is this dirt? Now, a little context to understand his answer is at that point, China was unsure about the security and relationship it had with the U.S., but was really increasingly hostile with the Soviet Union. So Beijing had a tunnel digging exercise going on for bomb shelters. So I had picked what I thought was the safest thing in the world to talk about, dirt, and it turns out I'm talking about a strategic with a whole man. And the man looked at the dirt, he looked at me, he looked at the dirt and said, "What dirt?" Right? And I thought that was pretty clever. He couldn't talk about the issue in his mind, and so rather than have to explain the thing, he just denied its existence. And I think that's a little metaphor for, it's hard to know what a person's telling you if you don't know the context in which they're answering the question. And I think so often we don't really know what is the circumstance of the people I'm talking to. Why are they giving you this answer? There's an underlying rationale. The problem is we don't understand it, right? And of course, the Chinese are not necessarily always trying to make it perfectly clear what's going on. So, but anyway, that was that. Miss Turner, and teachers made such a big difference in my life. And the first one, many in many dimensions, but as it pertains to China, was I was a senior in Palo Alto High School near Stanford. And as far as I know, was the only Far Eastern history course at that time taught in a public school in California. You may correct me, but that's what I've always believed. And the teacher was Miss Turner. And her sign-on phrase the first day of class is, "It's Miss Turner and I like it that way," right? She was marking it that she was her own person, did her own thing. And in summer, she went out to Asia, to the East-West Center that had just been created in 1960. And she came back and told her students about Asia and what's going on and all the wonderful things that are going on, and really got students interested. And beyond just the energy was the framework she gave. And her basic framework is that, look at China, and for that matter, at that point, Japan were the main thing she was talking about in Far Eastern history, was that these are proud, long civilizations that have their own values, structure, and things that give meaning to their life. And they have strong nationalism and are trying to find a dignified role in the world that isn't Western, but has the things of the West. But getting the things of the West often transforms you into what you don't really want to become. And there's this dilemma of modernization. This is a senior in high school, right? She really treated her like, this is serious. You got to understand this. And so anyway, she just changed my life. And I went across the street to Stanford, and then I met a whole series of professors that energized me. But, I think teaching is really a noble enterprise. You shape alternatives for people. You give them new aspirations, new objectives in life. Anyway, I just had terrific teachers, and that was a love note to Miss Turner.
And she makes a return appearance, and the idea of, specifically China and the tension between wanting to remain Chinese and yet adopt technologies that can advance things.
How can we get the things of the West without being the West?
And of course, there's been a lot of debate about that framework and all of those things. But as you explain, you've used it to good effect for a long time.
Well, it's not a demeaning construction to me. There is difference in the world. And I know the old Asian values debate that we have, and I don't tend to either extreme, but we have evolved along distinct paths, and it isn't credible to me to think none of that matters.
Yeah. Three well-known in their realms individuals that you highlight as making a difference. One is the governor that you mentioned
In Ohio?
Ohio's Big Jim Rhodes, who I didn't know about, but like Jerry Brown, was elected to and served 4 terms, non-consecutive terms as governor. And this was somebody who saw opportunity in Japan and in China.
Right.
And maybe you could say something about him as a subnational leader who wasn't concerned with big strategy. He was concerned with what?
Right. Well, to put it at the end, after we began to establish the relationship between Ohio and Hubei province, the capital of which is Wuhan, he led a trade delegation there. And he sat down with, I forget the leader he sat down with, it'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, he sat down with the provincial head, Shen Pixian, as I recall. I may be wrong about that. But in any case, he sat down and he pulled out his wallet and says, "I speak your language, money." Now, you might say that's crude, but it is direct. And he was dealing with China's revolutionary generation. And as Li Xianyan at the time was vice premier, later became president of China, in one of the early trips, he said, "I can't promise you how reform's going to go, but nobody's going to starve to death." So actually, with this Rust Belt starting in Ohio and Rhodes concerned about employment there, and Li Xianyan and the leadership concerned about feeding the Chinese people, that was so insensitive. It sounds totally crude the way I put it. But the point is, they both knew what their interests were and could see how the other served that interest. And that relationship continues to this day. Now, just as a little interesting aside, the state Senate legislature in Ohio is now considering Senate Bill, I think it's 78, but don't hold me to the number, which would end all educational relationships of state universities and China. So it's a real fight, at least through last week, I think the fight was going on. So all of this, but the point is that his basic mantra was, there are only 3 words in politics that matter, Mike. Jobs, jobs, jobs. We need jobs, and he brought Honda first to Marysville, Ohio, transformed the U.S. auto industry with Japanese then investment, but he had hopes to bring in Chinese investment, and ultimately it was to his successors. There's a huge glass factory in Dayton that employs 2,000 people at least.
Yeah, the auto glass made famous in the Netflix documentary American Factory.
Yeah. So that was his motivation. And he was a very conservative in almost all dimensions in politics in Ohio, but he believed in education and he believed in investment in industry. And he saw a common interest there and pursued it. And I spent a considerable amount of time talking about how we built the education relationship between Hubei and Ohio State, and the state of Ohio, really.
Yeah, and then you were involved, at the national level, helping to advance these causes. I was going to ask you about Zhu Rongji, who's on the cover, and Jiang Zemin, who you described as the most underrated of China's post-Mao supreme leaders. And I would ask for you to talk about them, but time pressures are going to keep me from doing that. I want to skip to the question of systems and what your look, because you learned by talking to people and by looking at how people address various issues, how that maybe affects how you see China and how you see the U.S.-China relationship. So systems matter, right? And that comes through in your approach to research. It also, of course, comes through the various positions that you didn't take on. But you asked this question in the book: how is China the same as others? Rather than beginning with how is China different, you want to see the similarities. And maybe you could say something about how that research, that work on systems and bureaucracies, how that led you to conclude that China is a place with a whole bunch of bargaining, and that we ought to pay attention to that bargaining within the bureaucratic system. And that'll be. I'll stop talking and we'll hear from everybody else.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll start with the last part on bargaining. And we've got lots of people that have spent, I welcome the interaction. There's certainly debate over frameworks.
So these are research colleagues from 50 years back in Hong Kong.
Literally, Stanley Rosen and I were together in Hong Kong, 73-4, and Mike there longer. But much of our field actually went through there. It was a socializing experience. I would say 90 to 95% of us got along. A remarkable fraction continued throughout their entire careers because of, I think, in part, our socialization. And we liked each other, we helped each other, and that kind of thing. So one of the themes is field building matters. Institutions matter. Leadership, get resources. These are all things that academics don't naturally do, but they're very important to the academic enterprise that they be done. And so there's a whole part about how the China field, I think, was substantially increased, particularly after the McCarthy period, that pretty well tore it down. So that's one thing. But out of my experience came a kind of framework, and there were others working on it. I'm not trying to appropriate this whole process. Mike Oxenberg, Andy Murtha, that's not an exhaustive list, but a lot of us sort of converged on an idea that during the Cultural Revolution, you had Mao as a totally dominant figure. And much of the analysis was some version of Mao's in charge. So what you need to know is what Mao thinks, and that resolves, you can predict pretty much what's going to happen if you know what Mao thinks. Now, it wasn't always so clear what Mao thought. He wasn't always so consistent, and he was entirely duplicitous. So
does that resonate now with
maybe I'll move by that. But anyway, Mao in charge. And I had experience of spending 6 months looking at water conservancy projects in Hubei. And they gave me remarkable access. I went through the innards of dams and went across the reservoir to Henan. Anyway, a lot of experience. And I was the early stages of building the Guizhou Dam that was below what became the Three Gorges. The Chinese Tennessee Valley Authority was there. So I just wanted to know what's involved in building a dam or irrigation projects or flood diversion areas and so on. There's a huge literature in many political systems about how water, everybody needs water, industry, agriculture, electric power generation. Water, you don't have water, you have nothing. So, and it crosses boundaries. And so it forces different functional ministries, electric power and water conservancy, forestry, agriculture. They all have a vested interest in what happens. Well, how does China solve this problem? Does Mao have to issue a directive every time they decide to divert floodwaters to Hubei or to Hunan? Well, no, not actually. It's beyond his span of control. So most things that involve most people most of the time are taken care of at local levels. Well, how are they taken care of? If you have a system that relies on a top leader to say yes or no, most of the time you're never going to get his attention and get no answer. So the bottom has to figure out how to solve this. And how do they do it? Because none of them are in charge of the other. They're all independent stovepipes. So you cut a deal, right? If you've ever been to a Chinese market and just think about the negotiating, provinces had almost treaties between each other. All right, I'll give you this much land, but you got to give us this much tax revenue that we're losing because we're giving you this land. We'll take so many refugees. Because we're benefiting more reservoir, we'll pay you for the antiquities that are going underwater. Whatever it is, it's like ending a war, practically. So that was an alternative view of, at least I thought it was, Mao in charge versus no one in charge. I mean, now neither.
Or everyone in charge.
Yeah.
Everybody has a.
We'll all concede Mao was
particular
really
interest.
important, and we'll agree at every level there's somebody kind of in charge sometimes. So the extremes are not. But what I thought intellectually we were, the like-minded analysts here, were doing was giving a more human, a more believable interpretation of how decisions are made in China. And if there's a whole purpose here is, we spend so much time talking about the difference in China. And they are. I mean, that's what got me interested. That's what Ms. Turner was telling me. But on the other hand, there are enormous similarities. And we're in a frame of mind now of looking only at the dissimilarities. And that's not going to end up in a good.
Well, let's hope we find a way to a better place. And we'll talk maybe about the deterioration in security considerations and how domestic politics influences all of this. But now let's turn to the audience. And I want to give a chance. And we have a microphone. Oh, it's not working. So we have a microphone that doesn't work. But we will ask first, the first questions get to come from
And then
students.
maybe you can repeat it or something.
I will. I will do that. I will do that. So, hands. Again, we're going to privilege students. to
Thank
begin
you.
with. Please.
Hi, I'm Bailey Shen. I'm a second year actually public policy student. But you brought the space early on in the kind of to that kind of piqued my interest is Tiangong,
The which?
Tiangong, the Chinese ISS.
Yeah, the Chinese space station, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm interested to see how that, especially space diplomacy or space embassy will sort of evolve in the future, especially with the lifetime of our ISS coming to a near close. What do you think can sort of come from this, especially as space is becoming more militarized and is becoming more complicated? What can that policy hold down into children's services?
Yeah, not long after the U.S.-China Institute was created in 2006, China shot down one of its own satellites, and that generated a lot of discussion. But Bailey's question has to do with the role of space in the U.S.-China relationship and whether or not that might be an avenue, hopefully, where competition/conflict could be minimized.
Yeah. Well, that's a really great question, and I'm really interested in it. I'm not pretending that I know everything I should to do full justice to your question. But one of the most interesting things to me is I had the opportunity to go to the space city in actually Beijing in the Northwest, out in the military section. Beijing, if bureaucratically you look at it, is sort of different ministries, different functional areas are located in different places. And the Northwest of Beijing has a heavy concentration of military, associated bureaucracies and so forth. So the bureaucratic geography is interesting. The old Soviet system had things sort of divided by functions and so forth. And China's kept, and that was China's way of organizing even before. But anyway, we visited Space City and I met China's first man in space. His name was Yang Liwei. And in fact,
Picture in the book.
yes, picture in the book. I got the idea, which I think is implicit in your question, about inviting him to come to the United States. It was quite remarkable that China has, at that point, put, well, not, he was the first, but up to the present time, I think China's put about 12 or 13 people into space and retrieved them alive. I'm unaware of any that have died, but if somebody wants to correct me, I'll stand corrected. So remarkable technical achievements. Now, of course, it's always true that the first country that does something makes it easier for the subsequent people, because at least now you know it can be done, right? You know it can be done. Now the problem is finding what way among all the possibilities to do it. So I think this is another example, along with high-speed rail, some medical progress, that China really has done well, and we would do well to understand it. I can report to you, and there are others that would feel the same way. I've certainly, for most of the engagement period, argued that if we could have cooperation with the Soviet Union in the Soyuz program and space cooperation, there's no reason on earth that we had Russia launching American payloads because they had more lift capacity than we did at one point.
Well, and also China, and that
Yeah,
led, of
so, well,
course,
that went
to
a high-
other problems.
Right, that was the Cox report in the late 90s, 99, I believe. And but anyway, we have not been able to cooperate with China in space. And I'm not party to the inner negotiations, so I may have only a partial view. But the resistance in the United States to doing that is decisive. Now, there may be unreasonable demands China's making, or China doesn't want to do it either. But this has been, unlike with the Soviet Union where we could cooperate, and then later Russia, we cannot cooperate with China. There's, in fact, prohibition to cooperating on space. And if you ask me when is that situation likely to change, I don't know everything I would need to know to answer that, but let's put it this way, I don't see that any time in any future I can talk about. I think that's unfortunate. And I just Stan, I know you particularly look conversant, you'll fill in the blanks here, but a couple of movies on space. One was called, was it Martian? And the one with Sandra Bullock?
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, it was the Chinese that rescued us in space. We're not making interoperable space vehicles. So if we get in trouble, the Chinese aren't rescuing us, even if they were inclined, right? So there are actually good reasons to have other space powers interconnected, at least so your vehicle can hook up to theirs and extract people and load freight or whatever, experiments and so on. So we're not, that was dream, fantasy movie. You want to add?
No, I mean, those are the days when Hollywood was trying desperately to understand their footprint to box office. They're trying to see it. Those days are over.
Yeah.
I'm even competing with Mike Albert, Select Ready, or something, trying to start the fight in Hollywood people. And they got an earful.
Yeah.
And the problem with the actual power.
Yeah.
He was like taking that trip. And they came trying to kick down Hollywood, and you go to Hollywood and you listen to that.
Yeah. Right. Well, weren't American multinationals paying greatly to have their products in the picture in China?
Yes, and I can't believe you tell you the name of the movie, but to one of the big blockbusters that made about $340 million in China, they had all this product touch, which it was sort of painful. And by involved in that holiday, and it's like pen, and it couldn't.
So enforcing,
Yeah.
And so that moment has passed, and actually there was a USC alum, Charlie Bolden, who was the NASA administrator during the Obama administration.
Golden, yes.
And he was somebody who advocated for this, but as you say, not happening.
Just one other thing is, at the very end, I mentioned the Cox report of 1999, and people that have more detail can certainly correct me, but the broad contours are American satellite manufacturers. I think Loral may have been among them, as I recall. Schwartz, I think, was Schwartz. I forget his first name. Was the CEO of Loral. Anyway, they were launching their satellites that were several $100 million a pop on Chinese rockets. And
This is after the U.S. space shuttle stopped going.
Yeah, we didn't have lift capacity. And so somebody got the bright idea of, we'll use Chinese rockets. They're cheaper. They can be launched from Western China, get into the right orbit. It'll be cheaper. And anyway, we don't have any alternative. And so it all in a business model sense made sense. Now, the problem was that all this was classified technology that was being put on the head of the rocket. And so how do you get the rocket in a secure way to the launch pad without the Chinese getting, that was one whole set of problems. But more fundamental, the first few rockets exploded. One, I think, landed in a Chinese village and killed a lot of people. So let's put it this way, putting several $100 million payloads on a rocket that explodes is not what the company business plan is. So the company business and the insurance companies weren't going to insure it. So you had to make it safer. And so we began to help the Chinese make their rockets more reliable. Well, if you're only of a business mind, that's good business, right? Get the insurance rates down, get the payloads up. But if you bring a security lens to this and say, you mean you're helping Chinese rockets be more accurate? And you think you're in an arms race with China? Suddenly, you just look totally indefensible. And the opposition, well, they were prohibited from doing this in the future.
Yeah, and that winds up being a local story too. Christopher Cox, local representative.
Bernie Schwartz.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of the companies were based here.
Yeah.
Please.
Hi, I'm Otto. I'm a second-year Master of Public Diplomacy student. I follow a lot of news about China from the guest countries. The tone towards China within the U.S. I guess media system has been very negative, but I think will continue to be very negative. And this informs, I guess, the U.S. public a lot about what China is. It influences them to have a more negative view of China. And as like a public diplomacy practitioner, I guess I'm curious what you have to say about what public diplomacy strategies can be deployed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China and maybe the Ministry of Culture, other than traditional pieces.
You mean, how can China get more soft power? Well, it's not going to be easy, which is totally obvious. But I guess I would say, and I've been saying this to China, and not only me, everybody who has this zone of interest that goes to China says some version of what I'm going to say. And that is the Chinese practice, and we can talk about the cultural management of foreigners. I mean, it's no accident. Weiban, the management of the outsider. The outsider's always been to be managed. And then you think about the Western ethos is, I want to root around, find out reality on my own and report it back, right? I don't want to be managed. In fact, management's inconsistent with fair reporting, right? You get my drift. Well,
collision of interests here.
Yeah. So the Chinese have tossed out not all Western mainstream media, but greatly reduced it. At the same time, incidentally, they have a big operation in Washington, a huge multi-story building, TV, all of it. It's the propaganda apparatus on, I forget which street in downtown DC. So there's an equity thing. You don't let our people in, but you've got all your people here. That creates a lot of, but the point is that China's policy is alienating the people that convey the image of China to the rest of the world. And it's really not a good strategy. They would get more good stories if they just let people wander around, talk to ordinary Chinese. They'd get much better stories, right? So I would say their compulsion to manage the media is about the single most counterproductive thing that they do. Also, Confucius Institutes. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that Confucius Institutes brought Chinese language capability to small colleges and so on. So there were good things in that. But when the person is in charge of the Hanban, the education ministry's component responsible for the Confucius Institute, comes to an international conference, sees the word Taiwan in the program, and starts ripping the page out of the program, not too compatible with influencing positively Western institutions. And then faculty begin to ask, well, is there academic freedom? And it just spins out of control. And we went from 105 or 10 to what, 20? Or is there even that many
Very
left?
few.
Yeah. Well, anyway.
I doubt it's double figures.
Yeah. So I don't know, that would, openness would serve China a whole lot better. I mean, look at, you can tell from just what I said. The fact that they let me root around in Hubei looking at all this stuff, I was happy as a clam.
And he's still saying good things.
Yeah.
Professor, and so we want more questions and students. It's not like you're limited to the front part of the program. You're welcome to ask these, but we'll go to Professor Ernie Wilson, then Professor Tom Holohan.
Great to see you here. I appreciated seeing this and looking into it. But for those of us who have, I'm not a China specialist, but we had a great relationship with a research program in China in this prime minister's office. And he said, hey, we need to know more about communication and strategic communication, South China Sea, the Sumatra Agreement.
Well, he was asking you to deliver what was just asked, right?
And it worked for about 6 or 7 years.
And who was the prime minister at that time?
Well, no, this was.
This is actually state council. It was.
Before she. So they started sort of toward the end of the previous administration. And then we were there when she came to power. Now, we trained maybe a couple hundred Chinese, not just professors, but people in the industries and all sorts of fields. And it went perfectly well for about 7 or 8 years. And we were in Jiaotong in Shanghai. It went great. And then it stopped. And so this relationship that we had built up over 7 or 8 years, very intimate. They would come here, we would go there, and it stopped very suddenly under Xi. And so for those of us who created friendships in that process, we'd sort of like to go back. And we've had inconclusive conversations. And so as a teacher of some of these, my colleagues here, is it worth my time and my energy to try to restart that? Or should I just go to the south of France or that region? So what would your practical advice be if we, well, 2 questions. One, do you think there's any hope in relaunching those kinds of initiatives? Or is it just off the table, realistically? And if you do think there is an opportunity there, what would you suggest that we do?
Well, a lot of sub-questions there, but I guess my first, it's sort of what do you see as your job and your goal? It's important that goals that are important to you be served by your endeavors. So it has something to do you immediately want to see professional progress in the area you're talking about and more in-depth, substantive? If you see that as your goal, I think you're going to have to wait until Xi Jinping's not in the picture, frankly. A lot more should be said than that. But I'm not optimistic that with the current, because he's extremely worried about internal subversion. And one of the first things he created was the National Security Commission. And at first I thought that was SC. At first, I thought I was going to be a coordinator for foreign policy and represented an attempt to straighten out Chinese foreign policy. Au contraire, that wasn't the purpose. It was internal control and to prevent foreign subversion. And I'm sad to say you might be interpreted as part of that. And I mean, I should know more than being, but I'm trying to be straightforward. So I think the environment is not good for anything that could be considered peaceful evolution, Puping Yen Bien. There's a whole vocabulary. And so that if your job, you see your job and your satisfaction as solving that problem, I don't think you're going to solve that problem until something changes, and we'll all know when that day arrives. On the other hand, if you're like me, I think I've defined my job in NGOs and so on is to be the last standing for dialogue. We got to keep understanding each other as best we can. And when that day comes that I said was likely to be a long time, there are going to be people to plug into and restart this. If that can be enough satisfaction for you and justifiable to your board of directors, and if somebody's willing to invest in that vision, then I'd say that that's your meaning and it's a sound strategy for the long term. But most business plans aren't the long term, right? So I don't know, is that enough of an answer?
Professor Holohan.
Thank you for your talk tonight. It's been really informative. From when Nixon and Kissinger first went to Beijing, one of their primary objectives was to put a wedge between Beijing and Moscow. And now we find that the relationship has completely redefined itself, given events in Ukraine, and that Xi and Putin are the closest of pals, along with their cousin Kim Jong-un, of course. How does this impact the possibility of reimagining a future strategic relationship with China? And if you were giving advice to the new administration, which is obviously not going to be inclined to listen to academics for advice, but if you were inclined to give advice, how would you suggest they try to move forward, given that context?
Well, actually, the advice I've given has been to the Chinese on this, because I think they need a lot of advice on this. And I think they blew a huge strategic opportunity. Remember when 9/11 happened and the planes go into the Twin Towers in the Pentagon and down in Pennsylvania? One of the first people, because President George W. Bush was inclined in a negative security direction. Condi Rice had already written that China was a big problem. And then the attacks happened, and Jiang Zemin, the president of China at the time, was on the phone, practically the first foreigner on the phone when George W. Bush said, you're either with us or against us. And Jiang Zemin phoned, and he said, I'm with you. That's all. Bush was operated out of his inner reaches, let's put it that way. And that was important. It turned things around. It's a long story, but it was an important moment. Contrast that with Xi and Putin. They had the Winter Olympics going on in February of 2022. Many Western world leaders were not going to it. Putin had agreed to come. That was a big deal for Xi. And Xi was also worried that Putin might attack Ukraine. Not worried about Ukraine, he was worried about Olympics, as far as I can determine. So anyway, on February 4th, Putin and Xi meet in Beijing, and they sign the No Limits Partnership. And if you read it, it's actually more alarming the more you read it. So, any case, February 4, they signed this agreement. It looked to us a little bit, not exactly, but like the 1950 security, a friendship and alliance treaty between Soviet Union and Mao. And so what happened is in 1950, after that, in 6 months, the Chinese and the Stalin give the green light, or don't put the red light on Kim Il-sung. He attacks South Korea. What happens here? Putin and Xi get together, and 3 weeks later, Ukraine's invited. So then at that moment, if Xi had called Biden and said, I'm with you, And in Georgia in 2008, China and the United States opposed Soviet activity in Georgia. If Xi had just phoned and said, "I'm with you," this is a violation of maybe the only consistent principle of Chinese foreign policy, which is don't offend or don't break sovereignty. If China had come out and said this is unacceptable, violation of the accepted world order, we oppose it. China didn't do that. It hedged and then ultimately seemed to be supporting it and defending Russia in the UN Security Council. Well, this just had a devastating effect on the Biden administration decision makers, gave the field day to Congress and proved, and I've always asked the Chinese ever since, I said, look you guys have always wanted to be in the club of the big respected powers in the world. What's the lineup here now? It's Western Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada on the one team, and you got the DPRK and Iran and Russia with China. Is that the team you want to be on? And usually the kind of people I talk to say, no, that's not the kind of team we want to be on, but they can't change it. So I don't know if that's responsive, but I think it was I think I even in the book have a headline that says fiasco decision.
Well, and the point you make in the book is the one they made here, that in 2008, when Putin went into Georgia to punish it, China said this is the basic violation of sovereignty. And China had made, in fact, Xi Jinping had made similar promises to Ukraine specifically with regard to sovereignty. And so it could have been a moment to say, these are the things that matter.
Exactly. And then you started off, as I recall your question, with the Nixon initial move.
I mean, I think the Chinese defense would be they're responding to changes in relations to the U.S.
Right.
Well, in the alliance building,
Well, I don't actually. If I it would be great, but I don't. But it seems to me what the Chinese line actually is. We want to broker a deal between the Western alliance in Ukraine and Russia. And essentially what the Chinese want is the U.S. to say, and the NATO alliance, that essentially enlargement of NATO was a bad idea, and it was NATO's fault to so antagonize and threaten Russian security that this became a plausible strategic move to push their perimeter out. And so the Chinese initial view was, well, yes, it's not exactly good what the Russians have done, but you sponsored it by this continual pressure on NATO alliance and so on. That's not our view. Now, my own personal view is big powers like buffer zones. We don't like to say that because that's like spheres of influence. And as I believe President Ford went down in smoke when he was once asked about the Russian or Soviet sphere of influence. So it's like a third rail. You can't talk about it, but it's reality because big powers don't like hostile powers too close in. So the Chinese have a point, in my view, but it's not compelling in our political system because, after all, it was a UN-recognized international borders, and sovereign states can determine their strategic alignment. So the Ukrainians didn't do anything, that would be legitimate precipitating of this. But on the other hand, it may not have been prudent. And then we go back to Holbrooke and the whole decision-making that coming out of the Cold War, and what did George Herbert Walker Bush promise the Soviets, and all sorts of, or Gorbachev at that point. So it's a long tangled story, but I do think that what it amounts to is Nixon went to China to offset the Soviet Union and China's now going to Russia to offset us. We've stood Nixon on his head.
And, please, Scott Cronin.
You read what Ukraine's response has been, so forth. They're playing both sides. actually.
Right.
So I think the economic situation has played a big role. I always felt like Putin regime was Putin is probably good. But there was a whole economic they buy the gas deals, they want the grain deals, grain, everything. Well, political, but it's also.
Oh, I think you raise excellent, to my mind, accurate points. And incidentally, China's not the only one doing that. Just ask where India is getting a lot of its oil, unsanctioned from Iran and so on. And China, especially because it wants to punish our agriculture to get leverage over us, now is forced to buy soybeans from Latin America and grain from Ukraine and all sorts of things. So yes, I think fundamental economic and resource interests, particularly like food and energy, have people buying in one direction, even though they don't support the foreign policy of those people. So I think there's a lot of economic realism there. But I would say there's a more fundamental point, and I'm still trying to think this through in terms of our own election. But the fact is that a lot of countries want to be under the American security umbrella at the same time they make maximum money out of trade with China. And Southeast Asia falls into that. They want us to protect them, but they want to have almost unfettered or at least constrained access to China's exports, investment, so forth. So I think, people want protection and profit. And so there's a lot of inconsistent behavior in the attempt to maximize their gain along those dimensions. So unfortunately, it's fairly complicated, but you can see why, and I'm definitely not, but this idea that the U.S. is unfairly treated, everybody wants to make money out of China, but they don't want to suffer the security costs of protecting themselves, right? So it leads to a kind of disillusion with American foreign policy because we're ending up with all these security commitments, and yet everybody's then running us on the economics. Is that?
Yeah, and Southeast Asian nations are not the only ones.
Yeah.
With these, East Asian nations, East Asian governments have some of the same. We're going to have to wrap up, but let me ask one last question. And this is a quote that an unnamed Chinese said to you, and that you have really drawn upon. And so I'm hoping that you can spell it out for us. You Americans, the Chinese, you Americans think that if we solve problems, we can be friends. We Chinese say, if we are friends, we can solve problems. So this is a bit of the chicken and egg discussion, but can you elaborate on that? First of all, how relevant it is to today's world, and what does it mean to be friends? What does it mean to solve problems?
That's a great quote. That's one of my favorites.
It's
And I think it does
got
make,
it, yeah.
I think it does make sense, or at least it describes a state of mind and a mode of analysis. And it boils down to how do people judge the intentionality? Because, if Canada has let's say Britain has a nuclear arsenal. well, that's their capabilities, but what is their intention? And they have no intention to use them against us, ergo we're not worried, right? Now, if North Korea had Britain's capabilities, we would say their intentions are bad, and therefore the probability of them doing something with those nuclear weapons is really high. We can't tolerate it. So I think that phrase refers to intention. The Chinese basically believe if you don't have the intention to hurt us, we don't need to worry about your capabilities. But we're in the peace through strength, right? We believe in capabilities. You wouldn't acquire the capabilities unless you had some future in which you would use them. And if you have that future, we have to worry about it. And so I think that quote gets to, we place importance on, we would say, I don't know your intentions. And anyway, your leader may drop dead the next day, and then we got another set of intentions here. But what we can see and what we can count within the margins of security capacity, we're wrong on Iraq and nuclear weapons, right? So you can be wrong, but the point is, I think it points to a very fundamental difference. The Chinese want to know what you're into. If you're benign, okay. If you're not benign, then anything you have could be used as a club. And I got to say, I think there's something to that.